So here we are on the eve of the 2026 World Cup. And just like the teams swap banners prior to each match, and they may swap jerseys at the end of it, I'm part of an episode swap with another podcast called An American Game. The hosts of An American Game are Tom and Kirk, and they always say that our soccer history mirrors, for better or worse, our larger national story. Now, the episode they shared with me tells a story that is decades old, yet is reflective of what's going on now. Back in 1980, our Olympic athletes, including our men's soccer team, made a sacrifice for our nation's stance against Soviet aggression in Afghanistan. And as we look at the geopolitics of that time in the context of the 2026 World Cup, it is reasonable to ask whether 1980 United States would boycott the 2026 version of the U.S. Enjoy this episode of An American Game, and be sure to check out their show wherever you listen to podcasts.
It's the middle of March. A destabilized Iran has a new leader, one who is extremely hostile to the United States. A global superpower is attacking other countries and leaving a trail of chaos, death, and destruction that will echo for generations. And the threat of boycotts hang over a massive international soccer tournament scheduled to kick off this summer.
No, we're not talking about now.
Why ever would you think that?
We're in 1980, with hostages in the Tehran embassy, Soviet troops in Afghanistan, and the United States leading an international charge to boycott the Summer Olympics in Moscow.
By the way, that is one of my favorite pitch devices. You think you're talking about one era, but it's actually another. Once I developed a movie pitch with Ron Howard about a radicalized group of white supremacists in a deeply divided United States who planned to attack the Capitol while the vice president was counting the electoral votes. The year was 1860.
History, it rhymes.
Anyway, back in 1980, President Jimmy Carter said that it was impossible to share a sporting competition with a rogue Soviet Union, and more than 60 countries joined, to varying degrees that we will explain.
Athletes who had trained their entire lives for the chance to compete were devastated. And among the Americans who missed their shot was the U.S. Olympic soccer team, the subject of today's episode, which, like our last one on the USL, is more timely than usual for us.
Just last week, Iran announced that it will likely boycott this summer's World Cup. Quote, "Considering that this corrupt regime has assassinated our leader, under no circumstances can we participate in the World Cup," said their sports minister, who also mentioned the thousands of civilians the U.S. has already killed for no convincingly good reason without congressional approval.
Back in 1980, the U.S. boycotted the Soviets over the invasion of Afghanistan. So for Iran, having their political leadership and schoolgirls blown up by a country that's making video game memes about it seems like a legit reason to not go to that country's soccer party.
Especially when that country's mentally impaired leader took a break from golf the other day to say that, yeah, the Iranian soccer team should stay home because he couldn't guarantee their safety in his own country.
He can't guarantee their safety in their country either.
We'll see if Iran stands by the boycott, and if so, whether they stand alone. Because also in the news last week was 10 players from a Jamaican club team being denied a visa to enter the United States for a CONCACAF Champions Cup tie against LA Galaxy. The players were from Haiti, which is on a State Department travel ban list for reasons that can only be described as extremely racist.
With Gianni Infantino at the helm, FIFA will want the World Cup to move ahead as scheduled. So there's probably a lot of frantic background negotiations happening right now.
As we've said, as we know, sports and politics are not separate things, which is small consolation to the athletes who just want to do what they love. 22 guys were on the U.S. team that qualified for the Moscow Olympic soccer tournament. Today, we'll tell a bit of their story, which was happening exactly 47 years ago. It's a story that feels like ancient history and also extremely right now.
This is An American Game.
So, once again, we are in uncomfortably relevant story territory.
Our last episode about the history of the USL came out just as the Players Association announced a strike authorization. and that labor dispute is still not resolved. But we felt that some context for it could be found in looking at the history of the league. So there we were, kind of in the news.
And then I was at the first LAFC home game of the new season, catching up with some guys who have sat in the section with me since literally the first game ever. One of them said, "Hey, you know what would be an interesting story is the 1980 Olympic team that didn't go because of the boycott. My older brother was part of that team." And then I immediately texted Tom and was like, "We're doing this."
So here we are, surfing the wave of current events. So again, let's see if the 1980 Olympics offer any, we won't go as far as lesson, but perspective on what's happening with the 2026 World Cup. History rhymes, right?
So let's hop in the time machine and set it for a year we were both probably wearing bell-bottoms, 1979.
Yup, jeans or corduroys with patches on the knees. We've talked about this era a lot over the course of this series, because this was the great awakening, or the enlightenment, if you will, of U.S. soccer after the long dark age that started after the 1930 World Cup. The suburban soccer boom of the 60s and 70s, combined with the downstream effects of Title IX and the NASL, were making soccer a cool sport outside of the usual ethnic enclave that had always nurtured it. Soccer was a cultural phenomenon, a rite of passage even. One journalist described soccer as the sport that ate suburbia. Over at U.S. Soccer, the ambition was to make some noise on the international stage.
Now, we're going to be talking about U.S. soccer a bit today, so let's define that term as it was known in the 1970s.
First of all, it was a new term. What was formed in 1913 as the United States Football Association became the United States Soccer Football Association in 1945, in recognition of the growth of the word soccer to describe the sport. Remember, it's an English term. But in 1974, the federation slimmed its name down to just the United States Soccer Federation, the USSF, which morphed into U.S. Soccer.
By the way, also in 1974, the legendary Manchester United manager Matt Busby published his autobiography, which was called Soccer at the Top, My Life in Football, which really should have put an end to any "it's not called soccer, it's called football" debate. Anyway, U.S. Soccer was run by Jimmy McGuire, and it was a small, janky, mostly volunteer outfit. But McGuire was a legit soccer guy. Born in Edinburgh, Scotland, he played for Scotland schoolboys on 2 occasions, came to the U.S. to play pro before briefly returning to Scotland to join Glasgow Celtic and then Northampton Town in the mid-1930s.
There's a profile of McGuire in the New Yorker titled Soccer VP from October 1956, commemorating his selection as the international soccer chairman at the upcoming Olympic Games in Melbourne.
Those were Summer Olympics because Australia. And McGuire was the first American to ever serve as soccer chairman, in charge of appointing referees and adjudicating disputes. And he took that as recognition of the progress the game had made in the U.S. Soccer, sport of the future since 1956.
Love that, love that. We should also take a moment to point out that those Melbourne games featured several boycotts. Egypt, Iraq, Cambodia, and Lebanon pulled out in response to the ongoing Suez crisis. The Netherlands, Spain, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein boycotted in protest of the Soviet Union's crushing of the Hungarian Revolution. And the People's Republic of China didn't go because Taiwan was invited.
More rhymes. Anyway, when the New Yorker met Jimmy McGuire, he was in his first go-round as the American soccer boss. He was elected president of the USSFA in 1952, while also working as an assistant vice president in the building management department of a big New York real estate firm, because, unlike today, being a U.S. soccer executive didn't pay back then. McGuire came back to run U.S. soccer in the 1970s.
And as we said, the organization was still small and janky. Here's a story from 1974 that sums it all up. That July, Jimmy McGuire hired Detmar Kramer to be the U.S. national team coach. Now, this was a huge get because Kramer had been the assistant coach of the West German team that had just won the World Cup. Kramer was also the guy who'd come to the U.S. in the 1960s and set up our first licensing program for coaches.
Kramer agreed to take the job for $100,000 a year. and was in charge for 2 friendlies against Mexico in September. Shortly after, he was in Houston at one of the coaching schools with Manfred Schellscheit, another legendary German coach and friend of this show, who had settled in the U.S. in the 1960s and was the first person to get an A license in Kramer's curriculum.
Literally, Manny's coaching license says A1. So as Manny tells it, he and Detmar were sharing a hotel room because U.S. Soccer was too cheap to splurge for 2 separate rooms. And Detmar said, "I've got a problem. Bayern Munich just called me and asked me to go back to Germany and be their coach. But I'm working for U.S. Soccer." Manny replied, "Do you actually have a contract with U.S. Soccer? Like, did you sign anything?" Detmar said, "No, I didn't sign anything."
Yep, Jimmy Maguire had died in office in November of 1974, and perhaps there was less due diligence than there should have been. I mean, the old building management guy would have gotten a wet signature, right? So in January of 1975, Detmar Kramer announced he was going to the Bundesliga. U.S. Soccer was embarrassed and threatened to sue him for $10 million for breach of contract. And then they realized they had no contract and couldn't sue him for anything except maybe making them look like a clown show. But a few months later, in the summer of 75, Pelé arrived to play for the Cosmos in the NASL, and U.S. capital S Soccer was moving on from its Detmar Kramer humiliation and dreaming bigger.
The obvious dream was to qualify for a big international tournament, either the World Cup or the Olympics. The last time the U.S. had played in a World Cup was 1950 in the famous Miracle on Grass, when the Haitian-born Joe Gaetjens, who had technically never become a U.S. citizen, scored the only goal in a 1-0 victory over England.
And our last Olympic soccer tournament was in 1972, when we tied Morocco 0-0, not a bad result, and then were beaten by Malaysia and West Germany by a combined 10-0. Maybe should have skipped that one.
In 1976, that patriotic bicentennial year, U.S. Soccer hired its first full-time, had an actual contract coach by the name of Walt Chislewicz. His first target was the 1978 World Cup. In September and October of 76, he led the U.S. national team into the first round of CONCACAF qualification, the so-called North American Zone.
For those of you who have listened to our first episode this season, you know that the North American Zone consisted of the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And the top 2 from their round-robin games would move on to the full CONCACAF qualifying tournament. Long story short, the U.S. came in third.
Which made the 1980 Olympics the next target for Walt. No, wait, the 1979 Pan American Games were the next target. Unusual for world soccer, Walt was coaching 4 teams at the same time, the World Cup and Olympic teams, as well as the Pan Am Games team and the national youth team, and running the coaching schools that Kramer had set up. Credit to Walt, Hall of Fame coach. The U.S. qualified for the 79 Pan Am Games, and our youth national team made the 1981 FIFA World Youth Championship.
But playing in the Summer Olympics would take some of the sting out of missing out on the 78 World Cup. Actually, a lot of the sting. The average American knew way more about the Olympics back then than the World Cup. And there was some cautious optimism that the generation of American players who grew up with the game in the 70s might be good enough to qualify. The absolute king of those players was Rick Davis, who was then known as Ricky Davis, which is how Tom and I will always refer to him. Davis was born in Denver, Colorado, but grew up in California, where he played AYSO before becoming an All-American high school star in Laverne, a city just outside Los Angeles that I have driven past many times.
That LA freeway that you love so much. I bought a
Shout out to
t-shirt.
the 10, shout out to the 210, shout out to the 60. Inland Empire, represent.
I bought a t-shirt at a vintage store on Portobello Road here in London. I think it was last year. Ricky Davis Soccer Camp. Big bold letters on a red t-shirt. Davis played in college for 1 year at Santa Clara. He also led his club team to a James P. Maguire Cup championship in 1977. 10 years later, I would win the Maguire Cup with the Union Lancers. Then we won it again in 88.
Keeping the cup in Jersey 2 years straight.
Any questions?
1977 was a big year for Davis, who also made his senior national team debut in a September friendly against El Salvador. Davis then joined the New York Cosmos, where he was the American star alongside international legends like Beckenbauer, Canaglia, and Carlos Alberto. Now, some of you may be wondering, wait, if Davis was playing pro soccer, how was he eligible to play in the Olympics? And you would be right to wonder that. The Olympic amateur rules were still really strict then, which will be a big part of another country's story in a few minutes.
When I'm teaching, this is a big topic, right? This whole amateur versus professional. It just keeps going on and never seems to be resolved. Okay, as simply as we can put it, every country was responsible for certifying its players' amateur status. This goes back to the Olympic Games in the 1920s when Uruguay was the best side in the world. They sent pros to Paris in 24 and to Amsterdam in 28. It was part of the reason for the first World Cup in 1930. Anybody can play, amateur or professional. For U.S. players, the Federation devised the Olympic registration form, which allowed players to maintain their amateur status while playing for a pro team. They couldn't get endorsement money, and they got paid and expense stipends rather than actual salaries.
19 of the 22 players who made the Olympic roster were on NASL amateur contracts. The Cosmos had a bunch of them. In addition to Davis, there was Dave Bursick, a goalkeeper, Angelo DiBernardo, Mark Liverick, and Boris Bandoff. Ricky Davis officially made just $20,000 a year for running clinics and doing appearances for the Cosmos. He had to turn down a $40,000 shoe deal. Walt Chisowitz thought Davis could have been earning $250,000 a year just in salary if he went pro.
No doubt Davis was playing for way less than he could have been making. But we heard from club sources that there was another way the Cosmos paid him and Bursick. Remember, the Cosmos were owned by Warner Communications, an entertainment conglomerate that also owned Atlantic Records. Apparently, Davis and Bursick also had recording deals, just like Pelé. The King actually made some music, though. I wonder if Pelé made better music than our friend Alexi Lawless.
I saw Alexi was recently the Masked Singer on Fox, which must have been very exciting to the 309 monthly listeners to his Spotify music channel.
But that's enough about the Clown Prince of U.S. soccer.
Hey! Appearances, record deals, lots of ways to make the amateur sausage in the late 1970s. Perry Vanderbeck would be the captain of the 1980 U.S. Olympic team, but in 1978, he was a high school kid getting drafted by the Tampa Bay Rowdies. Same deal, amateur contract. He got housing in a car, $50 a week, little per diem, and he had to work the team's youth camp, Camp Kick in the Grass.
I love that. Camp Kick in the Grass.
Yeah.
That's a better T-shirt than Ricky Davis' soccer camp. Another notable name on the U.S. Olympic roster was Ty Keogh, whose father, Harry, was on the 1950 World Cup team. As much as U.S. soccer was counting on a new generation of American players, it's important to remember that there were parts of the country where the game had been passed down from generation to generation. St. Louis was one of those areas. That's where Ty grew up, and he played for his dad at St. Louis University, where he was a 4-time All-American for the Billikens before being drafted by the San Diego Sockers in 1979.
One more player from that pool that we want to mention is Ole Mikkelsen, who, until we spoke for this story, I'd only known as Eric from LAFC Games' brother. In 1977, Ole walked on to the UCLA men's team, where he proceeded to lead the team in scoring. And by the time he graduated, he was the most prolific scorer in UCLA history, a mark that still stands, and he's in the School Hall of Fame.
I mean, that's impressive. I mean, a few of those UCLA guys scored against me. I mean, Kobe Jones, Joe Max Moore. Well done, Ole. His UCLA coach was also an Olympic team assistant. So in 1978, Ole was invited to the first National Sports Festival, where prospective Olympians got to compete in Olympic off years.
Another of Walt's Olympic team assistants was Bob Gansler, who also gave us some perspective on the 1980 team, including the National Sports Festival.
It was a thrill for me to talk to Bob, 80 years old, and, Mr. Gansler, let's say that, is another immigrant who has had a massive impact on the American game. Born in Hungary, then relocated to Germany after World War II, his family came to Milwaukee when he was 10. He went on to become a Hall of Fame coach, and his son Bob played with us at Princeton.
In 1978, he was a part-time assistant Olympic coach because U.S. soccer wouldn't pay for full-time assistants. But Gansler said that Walt and his staff didn't dwell on what they didn't have. Quote, "We were all idealists. We always thought it was doable," unquote.
Yeah, Mr. Gansler was a full-time teacher, German and history at Marquette High School. Gansler pointed out that the U.S. Olympic team had done pretty poorly in Montreal in 1976, and that the Eastern Bloc had dominated, partly through the use of professional athletes and steroids.
So the National Sports Festival was created to help the U.S. athletes keep up, give them some competition, right? Iron sharpens iron. And in soccer, it became part of a new national talent ID system, along with the Olympic Development Program, better known as ODP.
Yeah, before 1978, there was no structure to scout players. U.S. soccer on the East Coast had no budget to travel to the West Coast. Gansler told us that the national team coaches would put together so-called telephone teams. They'd call coaches and scouts, and they'd get players, referrals, sight unseen from around the country.
At the National Sports Festival, the players were divided by regions for a 4-team tournament, much the way the first women's national team would be selected for the Mundialito in 1985.
Which we covered in Season 1 in the episode Little Earthquakes, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Now, Ole Mikkelsen was put on the West team, which was coached by Lothar Osiander, yet another immigrant who became an American coaching legend, who was also a friend and colleague of Walt Chisowitz. So when Ole opened the tournament with 2 goals in the first game, his next invite was to a national team camp. Don Ebert from Southern Illinois University Edwardsville and UConn's Joe Marone were also discovered at that tournament. Mikkelsen remembers what it was like to be a college kid in the national team pool back then. You'd be, going to classes, living your life in college, and then you get a letter saying, pack your bag, you're going to a camp or you're going to a game. Call this number at American Express Travel and they'll arrange for your plane ticket. And then you'd have to go around to your teachers and show them the letter and try to reschedule midterms.
Some of those teachers would say, "Oh, that looks interesting. Good luck." Others would say, "If you miss the test, you fail the class."
I don't think that would have been you.
No. I'm a firm believer in experiential education. Like a twist on a Springsteen song. We learn more from the 3-minute record than we ever did in school. Anyway, juggling being a full-time student with national team duty back then was as janky as most of the rest of U.S. soccer. But as Ole told us, there is nothing more humbling than putting on a U.S. jersey.
So Walt Chisowitz had his team, a mix of sort of amateurs and total amateurs, and the march to Olympic qualification began. The U.S. was once again placed in the North American zone, which now included Bermuda alongside Mexico and Canada. The U.S. drew Mexico first, 2 games, away at León and then back home at Giant Stadium. And Chisowitz immediately ran into one of the drawbacks of the Olympic registration form, that whole arrangement with the NASL. Teams didn't have to release their players for national team duty.
Bob Gansler also blames the Englishmen who ran the NASL at the time. They didn't think much of U.S. soccer and that, U.S. soccer people knew that much, and they were reluctant to be helpful.
Ty Keogh, playing for the San Diego Sockers, was one of several players held back at the last minute. So Chisowitz and his staff had to scramble to come up with a new starting lineup at the airport on the way to Mexico.
On May 23, 1979, the U.S. lost to Mexico in León 4-0. 11 days later, Mexico won the return match 2-0 at Giant Stadium.
A game that Ty Keogh was released for at the last minute, taking a red-eye flight from San Diego to New Jersey the morning of the game. And Rick Davis missed the game because the Cosmos thought it was more important that he play with them against the Toronto Blizzard right after.
The Olympic qualifier was basically the opening act of a soccer doubleheader at the Meadowlands.
And the U.S. was knocked out.
"I hope these 2 games will wake up some people," said Chisowitz, who felt that the U.S. wasn't taking its national team seriously enough. And he was right. But he was also upset with the Mexican Soccer Federation, because he and the entire U.S. team knew that the first game in Mexico had been against a reinforced pro team.
What's the difference between a pro team in Mexico and an American team of amateurs playing pro soccer? Well, Rick Davis and Ty Keogh would argue that their gray area status made it harder for them to stand up to their teams and be released for games that the U.S. needed to win. And again, it was up to each country to certify its amateur status, and Mexico had cheated. Eltree were disqualified, and the U.S. had a second chance.
In December of 1979, they'd roll over Bermuda in the second round, 3-0 and 5-0. That's right, Bermuda had kicked the crap out of Canada in round one, outscoring our northern neighbors 8-2 over 2 games.
As 1979 came to a close, the U.S. had a spot in the final round-robin tournament against Costa Rica and Suriname. The top 2 teams would make it to the Olympics. Quick, picture Suriname on a map. Nope, it's not there.
But CONCACAF qualifying was far from the biggest news in the world that month. On December 25th, the Soviet army crossed into Afghanistan, marking the formal beginning of its invasion. If players on the U.S. Olympic soccer team were reading the news, they had no idea they'd soon be part of it.
And as the calendar in our story flips to 1980, we'll take a quick break to let you look up where Suriname is. Come on, show some respect. Okay, first of all, Suriname, picture South America. Do you see Venezuela right at the top? Okay, now go to the right. That's Guyana. Go one more. That's Suriname.
Next, have you subscribed to An American Game?
Have you even rated it? Just click any number of stars between 4 and 5.
Come on, we do so much and ask so little.
Seriously, every episode is artisan crafted. We don't have a team of researchers. I don't subcontract my parts out to USC film school students, which, why would I do that? Who would even think of that?
We just roll up the sleeves, like artisans. We do the research and try to turn it into a reasonably entertaining story for you to half listen to while you're driving your car or doing your errands.
Or walking around the track while your kid's at soccer practice. Chris W. in California. I'll see you at the next LAFC game. But yes, whether you like it or not, we promise this is a Tom and Kirk product. Unlike, say, a lot of TV shows you watch, where the person who gets the most credit or takes the most credit doesn't actually do a thing. Yeah, that happens. Little Hollywood goss for you.
Buy him a couple drinks and he might name names.
Or just subscribe, see if that does it.
And if you get in any trouble, we'll just blame it on the interns.
Ah, the interns. We love our interns. Okay, everybody remember where Suriname is? Cool. Let's get back to the show. It's January 1980, and Jimmy Carter's presidency is in crisis. On November 4th, Iranian students had stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 66 people, including 52 Americans, hostage for what would be 444 days. They don't need the plug, but the rest is history. Recently did a great series about this.
Remember all the yellow ribbons around the big trees in our yard. Meanwhile, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was expanding. On December 27th, thousands of Soviet troops, supposedly there to help prop up the government, stormed and occupied government, military, and media sites around the country.
Operation Storm 333 was an assault on the palace where President Hafizullah Amin was assassinated. It's actually a crazy story. He thought the Soviets were there to protect him, so at first he was like, thank goodness, the Soviets are here, and they brought lots of guns. Then they tried to kill him with poisoned soda, and then when that didn't work, they just stormed the palace.
I mean, they're always into this poisoning stuff.
They love the poisons. Quick time out. I love that. You've brought all the troops in. Let's try poison soda first. Okay. Just because it would be cool. Quick time out. We do care about getting the facts right. So I'm going to admit that I spent at least 30 minutes looking up how to pronounce Hafizullah Amin. And that used to be something you could just search for and be pretty confident you'd get an authoritative answer. But now you have to wade through like pages of AI slop with computer voices going like, Hafizullah, Hafizullah. So anyway, I went through a bunch of old newscasts and documentaries, but apologies if I got it wrong.
Speaking of getting it wrong, the Soviets announced that Afghanistan had been liberated as ground troops flooded over the border.
So the Soviets attacked another country, murdered their leader, killed a lot of people, and then hailed themselves as liberators.
Yes.
And that was understood to be bad.
Very bad.
By the United States?
Especially the United States. In January, Jimmy Carter set a deadline for Soviet withdrawal, or else the consequences would include an Olympic boycott, which Canada quickly announced they joined if the Soviets weren't out by February 20th.
The
Wait,
same
can I just pause and do my imitation? I did this over and over and over again as a kid in the car that my dad finally told me to shut up. Jimmy Carter, small peanut farmer, over and over and over again. Oh, man, he wanted to kill me.
Well, there you go again. That's the Reagan I used to do in the back of the car. Okay. Jimmy Carter also proposed moving the Olympics permanently to Greece, but the IOC rejected the idea. There is lots of money and luxury watches to be had with Olympic bids. Speaking of the Olympics, that February 20th deadline was during, and this was awkward, the Winter Olympics, which were happening in Lake Placid, New York.
That's the whole context for the Miracle on Ice game. Good documentary out there. Miracle, the Boys of 80. Sets this context really well. Check it out. That was February 22nd. And with the deadline passed, other countries joined the boycott, including China, Japan, and West Germany.
Jimmy Carter sent Muhammad Ali on a tour of Africa, stopping in Tanzania, Kenya, Nigeria, Liberia, and Senegal to try to gain political and popular support for the boycott. It was not a rousing success, as captured in the title of an essay published in the African Studies Review, "Welcome Ali, Please Go Home."
We got Kirk reading academic journals now. This is wonderful. Yep. While African audiences were generally sympathetic to Afghan human rights and open to a boycott, the trip was mostly a forum for frustrated Africans to talk to the boxing legend about decades of failed U.S. policy.
And while all this was going on, Walt Chisowitz was trying to prepare his team for the final round of qualifying. The first game would be against Suriname on March 16th in Orlando. The Americans had 2 full weeks of practice beforehand, which was more than they'd ever gotten. But they'd also lost Dave Bursick and Larry Hulser, who had signed pro contracts.
After going into halftime tied 1-1, the U.S. pulled out a 2-1 victory on a Perry Van de Beek goal in the 71st minute.
And 4 days later, the U.S. traveled to Costa Rica, where 14,000 people in the Estadio Nacional watched Don Ebert slot in a penalty in a 1-0 U.S. win over the Ticos.
It was a huge upset, and the home crowd was pissed.
Ty Keogh remembered, quote, "We and the officials could not leave the field and make it to the locker rooms because of the projectiles launched at us whenever we got close to the edge of the field. Eventually, we made a run for it, dodging bottles, bricks, and batteries. Once we made it in, we could hear an unfriendly crowd chucking rocks and bricks onto the roof of the locker room. We waited the better part of an hour and ran to our bus. No security to be seen, and now a smaller crowd began rocking the bus. We pulled away with most of us ducking under the seats. It was a big party in our hotel that night because we had survived."
They had survived, but their Olympic dream hadn't. On March 20th, the U.S.-led boycott became official. Still, the team played Costa Rica in their next scheduled match on March 25th at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, just outside St. Louis. The Lovejoy Library there has one of the great collections of American soccer history, including the personal archive of Thomas Bullets Cahill,
who contractually must make an appearance in every episode of An American Game.
Exactly. Worsted Wool had some staying power in season 1, but yes, Bullets. It was a homecoming for U.S. stars like Van der Beek, Keogh, and Don Ebert, who had gone to Southern Illinois and added another goal in a 1-1 tie that secured qualification. The U.S. team could now only hope that something about the boycott would change.
Like what? The Soviets certainly weren't leaving Afghanistan, so the issue was how total the boycott was going to be. I know I always thought of the 1980 boycott as a united good guys versus bad guys thing, but it was actually a pretty chaotic patchwork. Like, England supported the boycott, but left the decision to compete up to individual Olympic committees or athletes. So the British associations that governed equestrian sports, hockey, shooting, and yachting did full boycotts, but other athletes went. France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, San Marino, and Luxembourg chose to compete under the Olympic flag,
and they didn't take part in the opening ceremony.
Spain, Portugal, and New Zealand competed under the flags of their national Olympic committees. Weirdly, a country that did join the full boycott was Iran. That obviously wasn't meant as a gesture of allyship. The Ayatollah hated the U.S. and was holding dozens of hostages. But he opposed the Soviet invasion of a Muslim country and accused the Soviets of arming militants to take down his new Iranian regime.
Iran had also qualified for the Olympic soccer tournament. They dropped out and replaced by Syria. And there was no shift in Carter's stance on the Olympics, so the U.S. spot was taken by Cuba.
The U.S. had actually been drawn into a group with the Soviets, so the summer would have featured a U.S.-Soviet game. And while the U.S. team hadn't expected another miracle on grass, although Ole Mikkelsen thought that group had the talent to have maybe made a run, there was hope that a sparky game would ignite soccer in the U.S. the way it had just done for ice hockey.
I mean, hockey was nothing in the country. I think it's like Minnesota and Massachusetts and New England. Like, there was more soccer activity, actually, than hockey activity in 1980. But instead, the U.S. Olympic team played one final game, a 4-2 loss to Suriname that didn't matter. Then most of them went back to college and their NASL teams.
And remember, most of them had sacrificed a lot of money to play on those teams and still be eligible for the Olympic spot that had just been taken from them.
On July 19th, the Summer Olympics opened without them. Making things even stranger, players and coaches have been given their opening ceremony outfits. Bob Gansler still has the white Stetson hat and cowboy-inspired shirt and jeans that he was supposed to have worn.
On July 30th, the day after East Germany and Czechoslovakia won their semifinal matches in Olympic soccer, the U.S. Olympic athletes and coaches were invited to the White House. They each received a gold-plated bronze medal that said United States Olympic Team with like the Olympic crest. And while it was obviously more than a participation trophy, they had all worked incredibly hard to make the team. It could not have been much consolation.
Yeah, it's hard to replace the Olympics. The U.S. tried, sort of. Congress approved $10 million to throw together some alternative summer tournaments, like the Liberty Bell Classic for track and field, which was held at UPenn. 29 countries sent athletes, but international track rules forbade any meet that would clash with the Olympics, so it had to be scheduled before.
Which put it the day after the more prestigious Bislett Games in Oslo, where half the Olympic trials winners decided to go instead. Perry Vanderbeck brought the Rowdies equipment manager to the White House medal event as his +1 and got a photo of himself with President Carter, none of which took the sting out of missing his shot at the Olympics. Which takes us to 2026 and the sacrifice the Iranian soccer team will be making, again, because of geopolitics that they have nothing to do with. And we'll see over the next few months whether they stand alone in that or whether lawless, reckless American policy around the world and at home drives other countries to withdraw their teams as well.
Look, part of the inspiration for this podcast was giving U.S. fans something to cheer for this summer. At a time when our country, our flag, even our athletes might represent some pretty terrible things at home and abroad, we wanted to connect to our long history of the game, to the diversity it represents, the better part of our national nature.
So when the U.S. team takes the field, we'd ask you to think of the teams, whoever and however many they may be, who aren't there, and think about what they have in common with that U.S. team that had to stay home in 1980, punished for the actions of another country.
And remember what the players have lost, because the players do.
It's 40 years, Vanderbeck said back in 2020. It could have been 50 years. It never goes away.
And that's our story. See you next time on An American Game.
This episode of An American Game is a production of Soccertown Media and was written by me, Kirk Rudell.
And me, Tom McCabe.
If you want to hear more about any of my thoughts on soccer, Hollywood, or whatever I happen to be annoyed by, and that list is growing, you can find me on Blue Sky.
As for me, Kirk still has me in the archives digging up the next story, and on the Soccertown Media Instagram.
An American Game is a team effort. Our consulting producers are Matthew Nelson
and Larry Garrity.
Our original theme music was composed by our original old friend and former teammate, the multi-talented, multi-hyphenate, Patrick White.
Thanks to you for listening.
Yeah, you're also part of the team. Remember that thing from the halfway point there? You're part of this. So if you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, review, tell a friend.
We'll see you next time on An American Game.
Thanks to Tom and Kirk, the hosts of An American Game, for sharing this podcast episode with me. Be sure to check out their show wherever you listen to podcasts.